second speaker session of this Founder's Perspective. And it's my pleasure, first of all, my name is Jimmy Chen. I'm a managing director here at Stanford Energy. And it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Wang. So Richard is the founder of Crevice Consulting and a technical expert in the field of battery technologies. He's the founder and former CEO of Cuberg, which led a successful acquisition by Northvolt and grew to 225 employees. Actually, that whole ribbon cutting by Jennifer Granholm was amazing to see. So, he graduated from Stanford with his PhD in material science and from Caltech with his BS in mechanical engineering. And please join me in welcoming Richard. Thank you.
Hello? Perfect. One of the things I learned from GSB in their, I did a session on presentations. They told you to get beyond the podium. So I'm getting beyond the podium onto the stage to engage the audience. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Richard Wang. I'm the founder and former CEO at Cuberg. Cuberg is a startup that I founded back in 2015 when I was finishing up my PhD in material science here at Stanford. Professor Yi Cui, who did the fireside chat, was actually my advisor. So a lot of close friends here in the Stanford community. Cuberg is developing an advanced lithium metal-based battery technology, new battery chemistry and cell design that delivers 70% more energy per weight and also extremely high power capabilities for advanced mobility and transportation solutions, starting with aviation and also looking at other high-performance mobility sectors. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the journey that I went through with Cuberg, and particularly one of the unique elements is pursuing a rather early acquisition by Northvolt, our Swedish-based parent company, which is itself a startup, but a very large startup now, about 7,000 people. They've raised, I believe now, $12 billion in capital. You know, talk about an expensive game. Building out battery gigafactories is very, very expensive, and they're building out some of the cleanest gigafactories in the world in Sweden, Germany, and most recently announced in Montreal in Canada. So I'll talk a little bit about that journey and some of what we encountered, both I think some of the benefits that we enjoyed with the acquisition and also certainly some of the challenges that have been encountered. And then the second half of my talk, I'll zoom out a little bit to try to use the Cuberg journey as an illustrative example to think about some of the principles and frameworks that surround climate tech as a whole and why scaling technologies is so hard and what we can think in terms of navigating new technologies and products through that landscape. So I'm going to start with some founding principles. And so when Cuberg got started, we actually went through a program called Stanford Ignite at the business school, which is a 4-week, basically, business school crash course for non-business people, which I found to be incredibly useful. And that was really when I really started to develop some of these founding principles of Cuberg. And this was back in 2015. It was sort of in the wake of the bust of Clean Tech 1.0. Many battery startups had raised funding, gotten a lot of hype, but also gotten into a lot of trouble, went out of business, or really struggled to commercialize their technologies. And so as I was thinking at the tail end of my PhD about what to do and whether to start a company, I was determined not to run the same playbook that all these other companies had run. If I was going to fail, I would have failed in my own unique way, not in the same way that everybody else had already failed. So I was certainly going to be an innovator in failure, if nothing else. So run a different playbook. And what does that mean? From my assessment, the reason why a lot of battery startups struggle is a fundamental, I think, misreading and misalignment of incentives between investors, entrepreneurs, and truly what's needed for the market to adopt new technologies in these mass markets. And so there's a few different elements that come into this. One is that a lot of startups are technology first, which means that they're founded by PhDs often or with sort of a heavy sort of technology spit out from universities. But that also means these technologies are developed without a lot of thought necessarily on how do you scale and is this compatible with the existing way of doing things. And it turns out that technology problems in the grand scheme of things are relatively simple and cheap to solve. I mean, unless you're doing nuclear fusion, maybe that's a different story. But in general, technology problems are solvable. Manufacturing problems are the things that take billions of dollars to solve and drive companies out of business. So the first principle is develop a differentiated technology that's valuable, but also easy to manufacture. And it's easy in quotes because it's never easy, but at least easier by being compatible with existing infrastructure. The second principle is avoiding traditional VC funding, which I think is probably where we really took a very, very different spin compared to most other startups. And the reason for this is VCs are fundamentally driven by needing an exit which looks like an IPO. An acquisition is considered a failure for most VCs because it's not going to be typically a billion-dollar exit on the timelines that they're looking for. And so VCs end up driving clean tech startups to pursue the huge mass markets, whether it's the grid, whether it's EVs, the huge, $100 billion, trillion-dollar industries. But those industries are also the industries that are ultra cost competitive and the most difficult to penetrate. So I decided to avoid traditional VC funding, not wanting to go down that road, and instead pursue strategic investors, even from the very early stages with Boeing as one of our early seed investors. Also along with that is then a focus not on mass markets. Long term, the goal is to get to mass market EVs, but realistically, that's a journey that for batteries probably takes on the order of not even 10 years, probably 20 years for a new battery technology to mature, scale, come down the cost curve, and truly hit mass markets. And what are you going to do before you get to your 20-year mark? You have to build another business, which is really focused on niche, early adopter, high-performance applications like aviation, like high-performance cars, when you talk about motorsports, racing, these kinds of things that are willing to adopt a less mature technology. And then the final principle that we sought was to seek an acquisition by a major cell manufacturer, recognizing that the scaling journey is the most difficult part of building a battery business successfully, and wanting to have both the capital and let's say patience and also manufacturing sophistication of a large manufacturer to help accelerate our pathway to market. And so you can see, especially the exit strategy of pursuing an acquisition is intrinsically tied also to our financing and market strategy. If we had pursued VC funding, very quickly I would have lost control of the company. We wouldn't have been able to sell to Northvolt, and we'd be having, I think, a very, very different discussion today. And so that's really how I thought about Cuberg from the very beginning, going back to those GSB's days at Stanford Ignite and what has influenced our journey to date. So I dug out this photo from 2015. I was a little younger and thinner back then, but still hopefully recognizable. This was us at the GSB, and so I just wanted to give a shout out to the business school for this fantastic program they put together. It really helped me to think deeply about all the different elements of entrepreneurship and how to really marry the complexities of climate tech with the realities of how do you build a business around it. And so a lot of what you see and the principles that I just shared come out with our journey. And so just a few highlights that I think illustrate that journey, and then I'll shift towards really talking about a bit of the bigger picture of climate tech. So we got started in 2015. We leveraged both Ignite as well as the Tomcat Center at Stanford, which was also a fantastic source for networking and mentorship. And then spun out officially in 2016. We moved to Berkeley Labs specifically with the Activate/Cyclotron Road program, which a lot of climate tech startups are a part of these days, one of the premier networks for climate tech startup. We raised a small seed funding round, and as you can see, not from a traditional VC or even a seed stage fund, but from Boeing, which is really an indicator of both our focus not on mass market EVs, but on aviation, and really pulling on strategic investors from the very beginning. This was predating the MAX crisis and all the other crises Boeing has had, so probably today I wouldn't be able to do this from Boeing, but back then it was definitely a good opportunity to pursue. And then shortly thereafter, you can see we were still only about 10 to 15 people, a very, very small company focused on core validation of a very basic prototype, but got networked and introduced to Peter Carlson, the founder and CEO at Northvolt, which itself was a startup, but already much bigger than Cuberg was at the time. And we got to talking and showing the development that we had, and over a few months made a lot of progress and drove towards an acquisition term sheet with Northvolt. And that journey was itself filled with crazy amounts of drama. I think I could write a book one day or film a movie around it. Just all kinds of crazy things that you can imagine. Government forces, regulations, throw in a pandemic, throw in all kinds of other things into the mix. But ultimately concluded an acquisition with Northvolt in early 2021. We were still at that point only 25 people, but starting in March 2021 is really when our scaling journey started. And from that point on till end of 2022, we grew from 25 to 110 full-time employees, really built out a pilot manufacturing facility in San Leandro, one of the most advanced pilot facilities in the US right now for advanced battery manufacturing. And then over time grew actually to over 220 full-time employees by the end of 2023 with a manufacturing expansion, with vertically integrating from battery cells also to battery modules and packs, and making good progress in actually demonstrating the products and qualifying it for aviation and high-performance auto applications. So we definitely were able to leverage both Norfolk's resources and investments as well as a lot of their scale and supply chain, and also honestly just the reputation of being part of a large and reputable company to really accelerate our journey in terms of sales of our technology, in terms of development, in terms of hiring, and a whole host of other factors. And so those 3 years really were quite the adventure of a lifetime and really allowed us to go very, very fast. At the same time, though, no journey is perfect, and pursuing an acquisition also comes with significant risks and costs of its own that are unique in nature. And so, and of course, I'm no longer at the company, and I'm not representing Cuberg today, but reflecting some of my observations as well. A lot of acquisitions, honestly, don't even go as well as this. A lot of acquisitions tend to peter out, whether it's because the founder ends up having cultural clashes with the big company that does things in a very different way. Maybe the parent company is imposing its own business processes that make the startup move much slower, and you're losing then the benefits of having that startup in the first place. Big corporations also go through cyclical periods of boom and bust in terms of their own finances, and so their ability and willingness to fund technologies for 5 or 10 years at a time can also be unstable. And so all these things do lead to also why large corporations struggle in many respects in terms of fundamental innovation and breakthroughs. But nevertheless, I think what you see with this acquisition is it definitely is a viable and credible pathway for accelerating the scaling of a technology, but also being, I think, very open-eyed that there's also many things that can go wrong. This is not the only playbook or even the recommended playbook, but it's one viable playbook depending on the needs of the industry, the entrepreneur, and really, what is needed for the technology to go to market. So then, from that journey at Cuberg, zooming out a little bit, I want to talk about valleys of death. I think that's been a theme today. And I love this graph from Third Derivative, which shows it's not really a valley of death. They believe there are at least 4 valleys of death. So essentially, it's kind of death throughout the entire journey until you truly get to deployment at scale. It's like 10 years of many, many things that can go wrong. And so with Cuberg, we passed the first valley of death when we spun out with significant support from Stanford, from Berkeley Lab, from grant institutions and seed investment. Norfolk got us through our second valley of death, which is from spin out to having done much of the core product development and technology de-risking work to get to where Cuberg is today with a very competitive product. Cuberg is about to enter arguably the third valley of death, which is how do you go from there towards building that first of its kind manufacturing facility at scale, where you're in that sort of awkward teenage phase where you are starting to come down the cost curve, but you still can't compete on cost with the mass markets, but the willingness to pay from your customers is also rapidly eroding while you're building out an expensive, risky facility that's hard to finance. And that's sort of that gap where it's pretty difficult to finance because it's a little too late stage for VCs, but still too early stage for debt or infrastructure funding or anything like this. And then Norfolk, our parent company, is squarely going through the fourth valley of death, which is truly mass market deployment, building out gigafactories, spending billions of dollars, competing at the world stage with ultimately what is a commodity product, comparing to like a CATL or an LG lithium-ion cell at the end of the day. And so each of these valleys of death, you are facing a different set of risks, but I think if you look at it from this perspective, this is the bottoms-up perspective of what an entrepreneur sees every day, is I'm gonna go through all these risky areas and I have to fight through and figure out where I'm gonna get my money and sort of beat back the competition. But you can also look at it from a top-down perspective, which is technology learning curves. And this is something that has happened in solar, it's happened in batteries in general, it's also happened for car manufacturing. So for manufactured products, there's this observation that over time, people get better at manufacturing. With economies of scale, with supply chain innovations, with process innovations, all sorts of things drive down the cost of the product. And it's actually a fairly predictable march of progress, where for every cumulative doubling in total installed capacity, you roughly drop your cost of production, in the case of solar, by about 20%. And that's also true for batteries. In EVs, it's about 15%. But basically, for every cumulative doubling, your cost goes down that same percentage amount. And this is basically a law for solar that has gone all the way to today in terms of where solar is. But I think the point is that it's a log scale. So in the early days, it's very, very quick to double. You're very expensive, but you're very, very much coming down in cost because there's so much low-hanging fruit. But then as you become mature, it may take you decades to double again. So when you talk about like the internal combustion engine, you don't have cars today that are $2,000 because You can't double the industry as you could maybe in the Ford Model T days. But the point of this slide is to really recognize where along this life cycle a technology is realistically, and thus use this knowledge to guide how you should guide your business and how far you truly are away from mass deployment. And if you have a technology that is relatively incremental, at relatively low risk, maybe you're already fairly close to the bottom, but most of the things that we're talking about when it comes to breakthrough technology and truly fighting climate tech, they're way up on the very, very early cycles of that technology learning curve. Truly, basically fresh out of the lab, immature, nobody knows how to build this thing, nobody knows how to scale it, there isn't a supply chain, there isn't an equipment industry that's been built around it, and realizing this is a multi-decade journey in many cases to get that maturation so you can truly compete at that global commodity scale. And so when you mirror then that sort of slow march of cost reductions with how you think about those valleys of death, then you realize it can be very, very risky for startups to believe, oh, I've built this product, I've validated it, I'm gonna jump to mass market deployment, when the reality is mass market deployment is how many, many companies get killed, and that's really because you're competing with, in the case of oil and gas, a century-old technology that has been extremely optimized with hundreds of billions of dollars in capital versus your first-of-its-kind product that you're trying to manufacture. And so navigating that go-to-market journey and scaling journey without going out of business yourself and running out of money is, I think, one of the fundamental, let's say, challenges and also opportunities of climate tech. So you can also see the same trend for the Ford Model T. People have mapped this out. And so the Harvard Business Review, going back to 1974, was already writing, I think, in a very, very insightful way about technology learning curves. So this has been known for many years. This is not new to the climate tech. And in Ford Model T, basically, costs went down as a function of increasing volume. What they also showed, though, if you actually go through the rest of the article, is this was not just a perpetual journey, and then today we're driving a Ford Model T that's $200, right? We have much more sophisticated cars, and Ford also realized that this ends at some point where people just don't want the Model T anymore. They want a better car, and they're willing to pay more, but you have to reset your learning curve. So actually the price of Ford products went up over time because they jumped to new products, and then over time it's better products coming down in price. So more recent example is the Tesla Model 3. And so it's a great framework to really look at any kind of climate tech product or manufactured product. And when you hear about either Tesla's going to take over the world or Tesla's going out of business, I think this framing is a very helpful framing for thinking about where they are in that deployment journey. And so if you recall, think back to 2017, there were all these articles, Tesla was 2 months away from running out of cash, and they were. Or Tesla will never be a profitable company. Each car costs $200,000 to make. These guys don't know what they're doing. But the reality is they were in a cash crunch because they were losing money hand over fist, but they were also learning very, very quickly as they increased production how to make those cars more efficiently. And then over time, by the time they got to 2020, then they had figured out how to make those cars reasonably affordably at the same time that with COVID, willingness to pay was going up. And so they had a few years of record profits because their costs came down faster than willingness to pay dropped. Now, more recently, Tesla is again hurting because they are not doubling in capacity nearly as quickly as they used to, and so their costs are not falling quickly anymore, but the consumer willingness to pay is falling off a cliff because all the early adopters, the people in California, we've all bought our Teslas already, and then now you're talking about mass market, $25,000 car, nobody is willing to buy a Model 3 or Model Y, it's too expensive for the mass market. And so you can see basically that cost curve looks like a steady march, but it's a very imperfect match to how the demand curve evolves over time and willingness to pay as you go from early markets to mass markets. And so I think overlaying that model with this model, which is really the consumer version of that technology cost curve, really allows you to understand some of the challenges of climate tech adoption. And so in the early days, if you think about, again, using Tesla as an illustrative example, the Roadster was sold to basically the innovators. There's tiny fraction of people that actually thought that was a reasonable product to buy. Most people would think it's absurdly expensive, this is not useful, why am I buying this grossly inferior car? But for a very small segment of people, it's great. It's the first high performance EV, they would buy it. They'll pay a huge amount of money for it, and that's great. Then, early adopters, that's probably what you would call the Model 3 and the Model Y. And the willingness to pay is much lower. People are not paying $100,000, they're paying $40,000 to $60,000. But Tesla was able to bridge that sort of deployment valley of death and get their costs under control, and in a few years with a great run and huge expansion. Now they're in that chasm, which has a shark in it. And so crossing the chasm is then when you get to truly mass deployment, where also a lot of companies struggle, because that's where you need truly immense amounts of capital to cross that chasm. Because you're trying to jump to the mass markets where the willingness to pay falls off a cliff, and you have to get super cheap products, but your manufacturing costs have not yet caught up, and you're doubling your volumes much less slowly over time. And that's ultimately where you truly need incredible amounts of capital to ultimately get towards then being, will Tesla be sort of the next Ford? They have to cross this chasm and truly get to the mass market for that to happen. And so that's why you see, I've counted 4 valleys of death. This is probably the 5th valley, which is the deployment valley of death, once you get to scale. But ultimately, it hopefully gets you a sense of why climate tech is so difficult, why things take so long, why it's so much of a manufacturing industry more than anything else. And ultimately, our ability, I think, to scale is fundamentally our ability as a country to become a manufacturing powerhouse again. And when you think about scaling in the country and people building out gigafactories in the US, it's not currently there. The supply chains are not there, the automation providers are not there, the equipment designers are not there, our schools are not turning out top-notch industrial engineers in the way they maybe once were 40 or 50 years ago. The workforce isn't there. And so all of this has to be rebuilt as muscle memory of how do you manufacture efficiently? Because that's what allows you to go down that cost curve efficiently without burning crazy amounts of capital and driving companies out of business. That's really what climate tech is about, is scaling in the way the Chinese have with solar and with batteries, and really doing it here in the US with new technologies and ultimately solving the climate crisis. So that's what I had to share today. Hopefully it provides some helpful illustration and insights on how at least I think about the world and how I understand when I see the next headline about Tesla. Just zoom out a little bit, think about the long arc of history and what they're going through and where they're going, and companies, hopefully many more companies that will be like Tesla that make it big and really truly make an impact. Thank you.